look at the situation that Trump is in, he is facing abject defeat. I mean, we could put lipstick on a pig, but there were limits to what you could do in that regard. He lost. This was a colossal blunder. And really what's going on here is whether or not he is going to accept defeat.
Trump foolishly, once again, went with the advice of the Israelis, put on a blockade, and now he's hurting more than the Iranians are. So the status quo suddenly is actually not as bad for the Iranians, unless, of course, he does something else that gets him out of that situation.
Hello and welcome to Switzerland. I'm Tom Switzer. Always great to have your company. And our guests today are Trita Parsi from the Quincy Institute in Washington. Hi there, Trita.
Good to see you, Tom.
And Professor John Mearsheimer from the University of Chicago. Always great to see you, John.
And great to see you, Trita, and you, Tom.
Now, President Trump has said today, that's Sunday, May 3, that the US would start guiding commercial ships through the Strait of Hormuz where they've been trapped. John, your thoughts?
I don't know how he can do that. What's he going to guide him out with? I would think they would have to be military ships. What else could he, the president, use? And I think there's no way that he can put military ships in the Gulf without them getting sunk. If he could put military ships to escort tankers or cargo ships out of the Gulf, he would have done it a long time ago. Why would he be waiting until now? The other thing is he has a limited number of destroyers, and almost all those destroyers are used for the blockade, the U.S. blockade. If he takes those destroyers from the U.S. blockade, sends them into the Persian Gulf, they can't run the blockade anymore. Plus, if they get sunk to the bottom of the sea, then there are hardly any destroyers left or naval assets left to execute the blockade. So it's hard for me to see what he's doing. It could be that he's trying to provoke the Iranians, and he wants to make it look like the Iranians are responsible for restarting the war. I do believe, although he does not demonstrate this publicly, that President Trump is desperate. I think that he and his advisors understand they are in deep trouble. And I think J.D. Vance is playing a key role in getting this message across to them. And I think they know, because the blockade only works in the long, long term, they have to do something else beforehand. And they, in the Trump administration and their acolytes in places like the Wall Street Journal, have been talking about starting the war up again in tandem with the blockade. I mean, I think this is a cockamamie idea, but I wouldn't put that past President Trump to do. So he could be looking to start the war up and just putting the blame on the Iranians. But who knows? It's just such an amorphous tweet on his part, and just came out of nowhere.
Well, if just to be clear here, that if this plan does not allow US Navy warships escorting vessels through the strait, how does this plan, the president calls it Project Freedom, Trita, how does he allow the US to guide these ships safely through the strait, especially given that these naval mines are being deployed by Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps? Trita.
It makes no sense. Now, of course, I agree with John. I would just add one other possibility, which is, the most benign or optimistic one, which is that there is some confidence building measures being negotiated between the two sides. And as a result of that, the Iranians will let through a number of ships that are belonging to third countries that are not involved in the fighting, which will most likely be Asian countries, probably not carrying any oil, but carrying other types of goods. And Trump kind of wants to take credit for it, but it's probably some kind of a confidence building measure that may have been negotiated between the two sides. which is partly because a lot of these Asian countries at this point are really starting to lose patience about the situation. They're the ones, I mean, you would know better than me, Tom, sitting in Australia, that are paying the price for this war. And Trump is only, 10, 12 days away from having to go to Beijing for a summit with Xi. And he's going to arrive there deeply, deeply embarrassed, or he should be, if this is not resolved by then.
Would he have any leverage with China, John?
Would Trump have any leverage with China?
Well, China needs the free access to all the transport through the Strait of Hormuz, correct? They're
I
buying
don't think,
stuff
I
too.
don't think, Tom, he needs leverage with China. I think the Chinese want to end this as quickly as possible. I think almost every country on the planet, except for Israel, wants to end this one as quickly
Oh, I
as
realize that, but he might be thinking he'd put pressure on Beijing to put pressure on the mullahs. How he might be.
He doesn't even have to do that. Beijing is putting pressure on the mullahs, and it put pressure on Pakistan. There's no question about that. But the fact is, the Iranians are not going to give in to the Chinese any more than they're going to give in to the Americans. The Iranians face an existential threat. They don't have many friends in the world, and they're not going to let the Chinese pressure them into a situation where they're at a disadvantage vis-a-vis two genocidal adversaries, one known as Israel and the other known as the United States. Just not going to let that happen.
Well, that brings
Can I add something?
Well, I was
Can
going
I
to
add
say,
something?
Yep.
I think it's also important to note that the relationship between Iran and China is not one in which the Chinese easily or happily would put pressure. They would have their negotiations with the Iranians and try to get something, but not using the type of coercive approach that now, unfortunately, has become standard for the United States. What is happening right now is that the Iranians are building and reopening a bunch of different landlines through Pakistan and other countries through Central Asia to reach China. And this is done in collaboration with the Chinese. The Chinese announced just yesterday that they're not going to accept any interdiction by American ships in the Indian Ocean of Chinese ships carrying Iranian oil. Which is a much harsher pushback from the Chinese on this than we've ever seen before, where the U.S. actually has, on a couple of occasions, taken tankers that were carrying oil that the Chinese already had purchased. So I think you're seeing a toughening position by the Chinese vis-a-vis the U.S. And behind the scenes, I'm sure they're having some tough conversations with the Iranians, but that one is nevertheless more collaborative and kind of solutions-oriented than what we saw from the Chinese, just pushing straight back against any idea that the U.S. would be able to take any of their ships.
And yet, meanwhile, Trita, it's been reported that Tehran's put forward this 3-phase proposal. You've called it a grand bargain. Tell us more.
So this is a proposal that has been reported in a couple of outlets. Some elements of it, I also mentioned in my Substack post, I didn't find entirely convincing. So I don't think the entire package is necessarily accurate, but I think it probably carries the contours of what the Iranians have put forward. It would be a 3-phase proposal. What was really striking, first of all, it is that the Iranians really are looking for not an end to the hostilities, not an end to, not just a ceasefire, not even an end to the war. They're looking for an end to the U.S.-Iran conflict of 47 years. They're looking to make sure that there's not only a non-aggression pact, but also something that is embodied in international mechanisms to ensure that the war doesn't restart, which suggests that this had to be codified at a minimum in a UN Security Council resolution, and that they want the Chinese and the Russians to be guarantors of it when you look at the language that was released. Interestingly enough, they're putting an end to the war at the very first phase. The reason I thought that was interesting is because if that happens, then in the next phase, when they're supposed to negotiate the nuclear deal, the Iranians don't have that much leverage. They have their nuclear assets. But we've seen that the nuclear assets are no longer sufficient to compel the U.S. to give any major concessions to the Iranians. So I suspect that the reason why they put that in the first part is potentially because it's a concession to the Chinese and Asian countries, trying to essentially make sure that they get the Strait open, etc., first, so that these countries will not suffer economically before they go to the nuclear talks, even though it actually reverses things from the standpoint of where Iran would have the greatest amount of leverage. And the last phase would be, if all of this works out, that there would be a new security architecture set up for the Persian Gulf. which is a long-standing Iranian position already back in Resolution 598 that ended the Iraq-Iran war. The Iranians interjected, I think, the second to last paragraph about that, and that it would actually be done under the auspices of the P5.
What about
But
the uranium enrichment though?
so on the Iranian enrichment, that's the part that I found most unconvincing. For instance, it said that it would be either downblending or giving up the 60%. I think giving up the 60% is probably unlikely. Downblending is what it was supposed to happen in the Geneva proposal that Trump didn't accept, even though he should have. They're saying a moratorium of enrichment for 15 years. I find that unlikely. I can see a scenario in the Geneva proposal. The Iranians essentially, together with the Omanis, agreed on this idea that they would only enrich uranium for specific needs, and only two needs were identified. The TRR reactor that is producing medical isotopes, and a new reactor doesn't even go online for another 7 years. Now, the TRR already has fuel pads that last for another 5 to 7 years. So in essence, the Iranians would not have a need for enrichment for 5 to 7 years. And that's how they would get around the idea of them not enriching. It wouldn't be a moratorium. It would be on a needs basis. Now, could you extend that to 15? You could. You could downblend the 60% and immediately turn it into fuel pads for the TRR. Or you could have Russia or France provide these fuel pads upfront so that the Iranians have guaranteed energy or fuel pads for these reactors for another 50. So there's some elements that are possible to do, but the idea that, it would be a moratorium or that they would give out or give up the entire 60%, I find unlikely.
Okay, so still a bit murky, but we're talking about possibly a 15-year enrichment freeze, a guarantee to a non-return to war, compensation clauses, a new regional architecture, which presumably means, from Iran's perspective, America restraining Israel. John, can you imagine Washington signing up to those terms as Trita has put forward?
No. I had a somewhat different view than Trita did on the nuclear issue, and I'd be
Right.
curious what he has to say. Uh, and let me just preface what I'm going to say by noting that it's not clear exactly what the agreement looks like. To some extent, it's like reading tea leaves to try and figure out what this new Iranian proposal is. But I interpreted it to say, which is pretty much consistent with what Trita said, that in the first 30-day period, we actually implement the ceasefire. It's important to emphasize there is no ceasefire now. There's a pause. To get a ceasefire, you need to stop the fighting in Lebanon and you need to open the strait. That was the original deal. So in the first 30 days, you'll end the fighting in Lebanon. Good luck on that. And two, you'll open the strait. And then you'll have the ceasefire for 30 days. Then you go to the next phase. And as Trita said, this is where you set in motion some sort of scheme where Iran is guaranteed that the war will not start up, whether it's Security Council resolution or whatever. But that's in the second phase. And as I read the second phase as well, Trita, they were also talking about ending sanctions, reparations, some sort of resolution of what American bases in the Gulf would look like afterwards. This is in the second phase. Then in the third phase, they deal with the nuclear issue. Now, I think that story I tell is consistent for the most part with what Trita says. But where I disagree with Trita, and again, I'd be curious to know what he thinks, and you think, Tom, I think that the Americans lose all their leverage if you put the nuclear issue to the end. That's how I thought about it when I read it. Because once you say no more war, which you get in the second phase, and once you say no more blockade, which you get in the first phase, where's the American leverage on Iran?
Yeah, where is the American leverage on Iran if you kick the can down the road on nuclear enrichment? Trita.
So I think I differ there a little bit. I think it's a great question. Let me answer how I see it. If you go to that scenario, then you're essentially in the scenario prior to the war beginning. So we're back in February 27th, with the exception that the Iranians have some sort of a guarantee to the degree that they had trusted that the U.S. is not going to attack them. What we saw in the period after Trump bombed Iran's nuclear facilities is that the Iranians just didn't have the nuclear assets to pressure the US to come back to the table and negotiate. They weren't doing any enrichment. They didn't have access to their 60%. They know that it's somewhere on the ground, but being able to access it is a different story. So their nuclear dossier was just not what it used to be when they were running 20,000 centrifuges and were amassing LEU and 60% enriched uranium. That's the kind of stuff that really worried people in Washington and provided the Iranians with leverage. None of that is happening right now. So you take away the war pressure, and it's not to say that the pressure of the war doesn't pressure Iran as well, but it is risking to destroy Trump's presidency with gas prices going up and all of the economic crisis that it's causing. Whereas the Iranians, despite the fact that they're in a very tight situation, are already used to a tremendous amount of sanctions and have plenty of different workarounds from it. And frankly, during the war, we're selling more oil than they were prior to the war and making more money off of it. So that's why I conclude that if they give up all of that and they're just relying on their nuclear assets, which at this point are very limited, they will have lost a significant amount of leverage.
You two disagree on these issues, but there's another school of thought that John mentioned earlier, the Wall Street Journal, the hawkish school of thought, the supporters of the war who would disagree with both of you here. And they'd say that time is on Donald Trump's side, that the naval blockade is working. And I just want to run a few things by you, John, and then get Trita's reaction. Here's the IMF forecast, a 6.1% contraction in Iran's gross domestic product this year. Iran has already lost some 40% of its GDP in 2 months. Year-on-year inflation is running at nearly 70%. Of course, that's prices for food staples and healthcare rising even faster. And then you've got President Trump here saying that Iran's regime is choking like a stuffed pig and it's going to be worse for them. So isn't it fair to assume that the blockade will bring the mullahs to heel and force them to accept Washington's conditions? John?
No. I mean, it all depends on how you think about modern nation states' ability to absorb punishment. There is no question that the Iranians are being seriously punished, but they're not going to throw their hands up. They're facing an existential threat from two genocidal states. And let's be very clear about this. President Trump has already said quite clearly that he has countenanced ending Iranian civilization as we know it and ending it so completely that it can never come back from the dead. Furthermore, Israel and the United States, given their actions in genocide, have demonstrated they have no problem when it comes to mass murder of Muslims. And given what's happened to Iran for years on end now, they fully understand what they're up against. So the point is, you'll eat grass if you have to survive in the face of a threat like this. So you could talk all you want about what's happened to their GDP and what's happened to this economic indicator and so forth and so on, but they're not going to surrender because they'd be crazy to surrender.
Yeah, Trita, what about the foreign fighters hired to control the streets? I mean, if those Islamist militias are not paid, I mean, they might pack up and go home. Their payments are now surely at risk thanks to the oil embargo and the naval blockade.
So which foreign fighters are you referring to?
Or just the foreign fighters that Iran's employed to keep calm on the street, to quell dissent. I mean, and punish those who have been. These are Arabs, not Persians, but that's what's been reported.
No, that's not true. So you have the Basij, which are the paramilitary group that the regime set up itself, that are significantly, playing that role. There's always rumors that are being spread by diaspora elements that those are actually not Iranians. It's utterly clear that
they are Iranians. They are all Iranian.
Yeah, I mean, every time there's a protest because of some sort of desire to believe that the Iranians would never do this to each other, they're saying that, the regime is importing Lebanese or Iraqis, etc.
Yes.
I've seen no evidence, at least of this happening on any scale that is meaningful.
Okay. Just so
if you take a look at what's happening inside of Iran right now, ever since the war started, these hardcore supporters of the government themselves, which is roughly 15 to 20% of the population, have been owning the streets. And it's been a deliberate strategy, and have kind of reasserted their control. And I think it's important to understand, money or no money, these people essentially see their faith intertwined with the Islamic Republic. They will go under if the Islamic Republic goes under. And given how undemocratic some of the elements of the oppositions also are, such as the son of the Shah, they should be worried about their own future if there ever was a scenario, which I find completely unlikely, that he ever were to come back. But going back to what the numbers you put forward, those are probably completely accurate numbers.
Yeah. So
That
we're talking about
there's been massive
hyperinflation.
contraction.
Just to be clear
Absolutely.
here,
Yeah,
hyperinflation,
wouldn't
disintegrating economy, shortages of food and water.
definitely.
Right.
I wouldn't be surprised if any of those are false, and problems going to get worse. That's never been the question. This is constantly the issue in Washington, in which the degree of pain is the measurement of success. The measurement of success is if you ever manage to translate that pain into a change of policy. And just as John said, it never will.
Yes.
When they view this as existential, in which that means that capitulation is not an option.
Yes.
Now, take a look on the flip side of it.
Yes.
It is not that they're not hurting. The question is, who can tolerate the hurt, the pain, the
Yeah.
longest and the most intensely? Donald Trump is now dealing with gas prices in the US that are higher than they were when the war actually was taking place as a result of his own blockade. Had he not done the blockade and it had just been a ceasefire, the Iranians would control the straits, which would not be a good thing from Trump's perspective. But traffic would actually flow because the Iranians don't make money unless they allow the ships to come through with the payment of a toll. And many countries would, at the end of the day, pay the toll. They would be happy to pay the toll in order to avoid the current situation. And the toll is not going to be that high. Doesn't mean that they will accept it in the long run or that they don't think it's a problem setting a bad precedent. Let's set that aside. But money would, oil would flow, which means gas prices, oil prices would come down. He could have had that scenario. Instead, the Foundation for Defense of the Democracies is one of these very pro-Israeli groups in Washington, pushed the idea that the blockade would be some sort of a silver bullet that would force the Iranians to lose capacity in terms of their storage, which would then cause the oil wells to be shut down, which would be tremendously expensive, and this would have all kinds of inflationary pressures in Iran, and eventually they would collapse. According to their estimation, the Iranians should have collapsed about 9 days ago.
Yeah.
It's not happened.
Okay.
In fact, satellite images show that they're still loading oil onto new tankers. So the idea that the storage is out, etc. So instead, he took a measure that now has shifted oil prices or pushed up oil prices above where they were when the war was going on. So all of the pressure release that he gained through this ceasefire, he's now gambled away with this blockade.
Trita mentioned the Defense of Democracies Foundation. John, you're well aware of them. You think of the other prominent supporters of the war. You mentioned the Wall Street Journal editorial page a few moments ago, Commentary Magazine, Brett Stevens, past guest on this program. They say that Trump still has time on his side. And, the US economy, just last week, we had the GDP figures showing 2% annual growth for the last quarter. The US stock market remains surprisingly bullish. So they'd say to you, why can't Trump simply ride out this storm? John?
Well, oil prices, food prices, and assorted other prices really matter enormously here. And inflation is picking up ahead of steam. And what you're going to have eventually in the West is stagflation, because you're going to have to raise interest rates to deal with inflation. And when you raise interest rates, you're going to slow down growth. And you want to remember that the economic consequences of the February 28th decision are just beginning to bite now. They're cascading their way through the system. And if you listen to people in Europe talk about the future of fuel prices for aircraft and so forth and so on, you listen to the British talk about servicing their debt, there is big trouble coming. And everybody knows that. And the Asian economies have already felt that, as you know, as an Australian. So this is only going to get worse with the passage of time. And that's why Trump wants to end this as quickly as possible. But the key question is whether the Iranians are going to throw up their hands. That's what President Trump, the Wall Street Journal, and others are betting on. That's going to happen. And I'd be willing to bet a lot of money that's not going to happen. And I'd like them to show me a historical example involving a war of this sort, where massive punishment was inflicted on a society, and the leadership then threw up its hands. You just don't find any evidence of that.
Well, gets
Hey,
back
can I
to
just add one another thing,
Trita.
Tom, as well, which I think is really important? The two clocks ticking right now is not whether the US economy is going to collapse before the Iranian economy collapses. That's not what we're talking about here. It's whether the economic pain in the US is going to translate into a political crisis for Trump before the economic crisis in Iran creates a political crisis for the current government over there. And when you look at it that way, you see very clearly that Trump is going to face problems much, much sooner than the Iranians will. And that's what's all that matters, because he has midterms coming up. Republican members of Congress are getting more and more angry that he's not ending this war. They're going to lose their seats. And many of them have already, we have a record number of Republicans, more than ever before, who are not even going to run because they don't see any future for their party or their ability to do anything given the massacre that's going to happen in November. And a lot of that is, of course, because of this economic crisis created by this war and now by this blockade.
And the blockade takes time to work. But John, the critics, I'm sorry to drag on about this, but as you know, on this program, we like to hear the opponent's arguments because that makes your arguments even stronger when you understand their arguments at their best. They would say that because the blockade might take a bit longer, that's where a resumption of military strikes might be necessary to shorten the timeline. After all, the US and Israel still control the skies over Iran. So can you see this as a point where the Americans might resume hostilities?
I make 2 points, Tom. The mere fact that they do not want to rely on the blockade alone, and they're talking about bringing military force to bear, air power to bear against Iran, tells you that they don't have that much faith in the blockade and supports what Frida and I are saying. The second point is, I think if we start using military force, it will not work, and the Iranians will retaliate, and it will have even worse consequences for the international economy, and it will give the Iranians more, not less leverage. If I were playing Iran's hand, I would hope the Americans would attack me. I don't think the Iranians have as much interest in the status quo as they do in restarting the war. Because if you restart the war, the economic consequences for the West will be disastrous.
Yeah, wow. And that's not to mention the damaging leaks last week in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal about US munition stocks, John.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's, we haven't talked about that. That is an enormously important issue.
Yeah. Trita, how would you respond to John there about Iran having an interest in resuming the conflict?
I would, I don't think that's what he's saying. Compared to the status quo.
Compared to the status quo. Yeah.
Exactly. So I think their preference is to get a deal. Their preference would be to translate the gains that they have made in this war and in the period after into a new uncontested order in which, sanctions are lifted and their position is essentially accepted, and they have these type of non-aggression pacts, etc., that they're looking for. That would obviously be their pressure. But if the status quo had continued without the blockade, they would have been in a very dire situation because they would have lost their ability to pressure the US.
That's right.
Trump foolishly, once again, went with the advice of the Israelis, put on a blockade, and now he's hurting more than the Iranians are. So the status quo suddenly is actually not as bad for the Iranians, unless, of course, he does something else that gets him out of that situation. But if he were to go and start another war, he would, I do believe that in some ways he may end up actually doing the Iranians a favor. They will go after, first of all, they actually managed to now, just in the last couple of weeks, do a lot with the Chinese in terms of rebuilding their assets, etc. We also know that what Pete Hegseth was saying about how much had been destroyed was absolutely not true. U.S. intelligence leaks have shown that the Iranians have significant amount of their missiles, particularly the shorter range missiles that they would use in the Persian Gulf left. I think if we see another round of fighting, the Iranians are going to once again escalate horizontally in a way that the U.S. cannot control. They will once again have escalation dominance. And I think this time around, they're going to go after the UAE in a manner that they didn't do in the first round, even if that was a pretty rough period for the Emiratis.
So it sounds like Trump, according to you, Trita, is damned if he does and damned if he doesn't, because he's trapped. John.
No, actually, he's only reason he's trapped is because he keeps on taking Israel's advice. If he
John.
just goes out of that and he negotiates based on what he says should be the case, America first, we would be in a terribly different, in a much, much better situation than we're right now. He didn't care about enrichment before. He only cared about nuclear weapons. He shifted that position to the Israeli position, and then that kind of put him in a corner on the nuclear question. He can unlock that again, go back and say, I'm preventing an Iranian nuclear weapon, but I can tolerate 3.67% enriched uranium, just as the previous JCPOA did, or they could actually go below that. But nevertheless, he's not going for zero enrichment. There's a lot of things he can do.
Yeah, let me put this question to John and then get your response, Trita, because I think this is important about the Israel issue. Surely there's an issue beyond this, which is dignity and honor, credibility and prestige, which matters a lot to any American president, and especially the way that Donald Trump interprets honor and dignity. And, you know, quite understandably, he's on the back foot here because the regime looks like it's going to survive in Tehran. There's still going to be some kind of enrichment program in Iran. They've still got ballistic missile capabilities in Iran. And moreover, they've still got their militia proxies like Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthi rebels in Yemen. Now, these were the main conditions on February 28 for a successful outcome. At this stage, none of those conditions appear to be met. So how can Trump resolve this given all of that? John.
Well, let me make 2 points. One is a minor point, and the goal here was to do away completely with Iran's nuclear enrichment capability. So whether you put limits on it for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years is largely irrelevant to that point. The fact is, their nuclear enrichment capability is going to remain intact.
Exactly.
So just to reinforce what you said, Tom, he fails across the board. And what you have to add to that is that the Iranians, who did not control the strait on February 27 and have a toll booth in it, now control the strait and have a toll booth in it that they don't intend to give up. Furthermore, we had all these fancy military bases in the region on February 27th, and almost all of them have been either badly damaged or destroyed. So if you sort of look at the situation that Trump is in, he is facing abject defeat. I mean, we could put lipstick on a pig, but there were limits to what you could do in that regard. He lost. This was a colossal blunder. And really what's going on here is whether or not he is going to accept defeat and try and dress it up as much as he can as a partial victory. But he has not achieved, and he is not going to achieve any of the goals that he declared on February 27th or before. And furthermore, he's lost on a number of other important dimensions as well. A colossal defeat.
Trita.
John is absolutely right. I would just add one thing. He can still spin it into a victory if he strikes a deal. He manages to get the Iranians to give things that they were putting on the table in Geneva that would make it a deal that is stronger than the JCPOA. He lifts sanctions. He opens up the Iranian economy to American companies for the first time in 47 years. This is the largest economy that will have been opened up since the fall of the Soviet Union. It will dramatically benefit the American middle class and manufacturing industry. And he will focus all of his tweets and Truth Social posts and everything else on that aspect. And the American public, by and large, will mostly care about that. And the Washington foreign policy elite will mostly focus on everything John said. And he's absolutely right on all of those points. It's an utter defeat. But for Trump, the former of being able to say that he did all of these things and open up the economy and benefits American businesses is going to be his only message. He'll talk about it over and over again. He'll make up some stuff about it. He's changed the regime in Iran or whatever. No one believes that, but that's fine. But he can still turn this around because he's Trump, because he has that capability. Any other president, it would not even be a consideration or an option for him to even think about this.
To the extent that Trita is right, John, how would Trump's intellectual supporters on Iran, the Defense of Democracies Foundation, the Brett Stevens of the world, and not to mention Israel, how would they respond?
Well, the point is that the story that Trita was just telling explains why we should have had good relations with Iran a long time ago. I would argue starting in the mid-1990s, the time was right for rapprochement, and we and the Iranians both would have benefited greatly from having good relations. The idea that Iran is a meaningful threat to the United States is not a serious argument. But then the question is, why didn't we have good relations? And the answer is because of Israel and the lobby here in the United States. And the problem that Trump faces is if he tries to cut a deal and he tries to spin it along the lines that Trita was outlining, what he's going to run into is a real buzzsaw called Israel and the lobby. And this gets to your question, Tom. Of course, those people, in the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Wall Street Journal, and so forth and so on, and Israel itself, of course, are going to be beside themselves. They're not going to know what to do. This is going to be the end of the world for them. You want to remember, we can argue, I think quite correctly, that Iran is not a serious threat for the United States. But from Israel's point of view, it's an existential threat. They believe that. And they went to war thinking they were going to do away with this existential threat. And in fact, the end result of the war is that the existential threat comes out better off than it was going into the war. This is a disaster for the Israelis, and they will go to enormous lengths to complicate Trump's life and make it extremely difficult for Trump to do what Trita said he should do. And by the way, Trita's also right. There's nobody who could spin his way out of a situation like this better than Donald Trump. I don't think that for one second. He's a genius at that.
Yeah, but I mean, he has said consistently throughout this war period, especially since February 28, that if Iran had a nuclear weapon, the whole world would be held hostage. And he's doing something now with Iran that other nations and other presidents should have done long ago. And there is a widespread view that Iran should not develop a nuclear weapon. So Trump would have support beyond Israel. Trita.
Well, if there is a deal that actually is stronger than the JCPOA, then no, he will not have support beyond opposition beyond Israel, because every country in the world, with the exception of Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Israel, supported the JCPOA. It was passed in the Security Council 15-0. So if he gets a deal that actually has those nuclear components, which he could have done on February 24th or whatever it was, when that meeting was held in Geneva, by the Omanis, then he would have had this. So, and there would have been no objections from any country except for Israel and the Emiratis. Even the Saudis at this point will not be opposing it. John is, of course, absolutely right. There's, on the normal circumstances, there will be a massive, massive set of oppositions coming from Israel and its supporters. In fact, sanctions relief is almost the worst thing that Trump or the US could do. The Israelis want to keep Iran as weak as possible. You do that either through a bombing campaign that is intense, and then you may have to do it a couple of years again later on, but as part of their inhumane mowing the lawn strategy, or you have, in combination with that, massive sanctions on the country that over the years, over decades, that degrades the country's industrial base. So it's bad enough for the Israelis that the war is over. The idea that the US would lift sanctions would be totally unacceptable. But here's where there actually may be a unique opportunity for Trump to do it without having to face at least that level of opposition from the Israelis. Maybe Netanyahu is going to have an election in Israel sometime between July and October of this year. He has failed to translate support for war in Israel, which is very strong, into a political plus within the politics of the country at this point. He's fighting for his freedom, frankly, because he's likely going to be jailed if he loses the elections. And on top of that, Trump remains very, very popular in Israel, which means that in this election, Netanyahu cannot afford to be at loggerheads with Trump. He cannot fight Trump tooth and nail during this period. If he does, Trump could, if he wanted to, go and tell the Netanyahu that either Israel or its supporters in Washington need to back off. Otherwise, I'm going to throw my weight behind Naftali Bennett or something of that kind. And that could actually, so the degree of vulnerability the Israeli prime minister has against Trump in the next couple of months is actually at a record level. Whether Trump chooses to use that to actually get a deal that would be really good for America is a different story. But I agree fully with John. Of course, under normal circumstances, this would be so intimidating that most American presidents wouldn't even try to do it.
Yeah, but the obvious question to Trump would be, why then did you scrap the Obama nuclear deal in 2015, John?
Well, I think that he was very cocky at the time. He thought that the deal was not terrific, and it was not terrific. It was the best deal we could get. It was, I think, a very good deal, but it had certain drawbacks. He played on those drawbacks, and he withdrew from the deal, foolishly, I argue. But he thought he was going to get in place a better deal. He was basically going to get the Iranians to give up on nuclear enrichment. That's the issue here. Can you get the Iranians to give up on nuclear enrichment? And he thought that he could put economic pressure on them, maximum pressure. That's what he was thinking of doing. Sounds like you, Tom, talking about what the West is doing to the Iranians today. He was, Donald Trump was thinking back then, just like the people you were describing are thinking today. Put maximum punishment on the Iranians and they'll throw up their hands. And by the way, we caused in that first Trump administration, as Trita knows better than I do, a huge amount of pain in Iran. That maximum pressure campaign was very successful, but they didn't throw up their hands. And Trump now knows that he's never going to get them to give up nuclear enrichment completely, and he's going to have to work out some deal that he can say is better than the JCPOA.
Let's just change the subject just very briefly. The think tank that you co-founded and are vice president of, Trita, believes in foreign policy restraint and discrimination. And just in the last week, in Germany, where the biggest contingent of US armed forces in Europe is based, it's about to get smaller, 15% smaller, after the Pentagon announced it was withdrawing 5,000 troops over the next year. This is clearly in response to the views of the Chancellor criticizing Donald Trump. But leaving that aside, is it a healthy development for the Americans to start placing less military footprint in Europe?
Yes. However, it shouldn't be done in this way. It shouldn't be in retaliation because of a comment that the German chancellor did. It should be done because we have a strategic plan on how we maximize U.S. interests while at the same time retaining a strong alliance with European allies. But a strong alliance has to be mutually beneficial. It is not in our benefit, in my view, to turn countries like Germany into vassal states. We saw that the type of Germany that existed 23 years ago, that had the guts and the spine to stand up to the Iraq war, is no longer there. Instead, you have a chancellor who applauds the war in the early phases, doesn't say a critical word about it, tells people that international law does not apply to Iran, and then now, when the war has gone badly, blames Trump for it as if Merz himself had no responsibility in this, facilitating America's worst instincts. That type of a vassal relationship is not good for the U.S. or for the Germans. So yes, I think we should rethink all of this. I think it's going to have to happen at this point. John knows more about this than I do, but let me say one thing. What I see happening in the Persian Gulf right now is very different from the debacle of the Iraq War. Because the Iraq War, the United States actually won in 3 weeks militarily. I mean, it crushed the Iraqi army, obviously.
Yeah.
Even the political objective of getting rid of Saddam Hussein was achieved. In the Iran war, the political objective has not been achieved. And on top of that, the United States have been strategically defeated. So this is even worse than the Iraq war. And I think it may end up becoming an inflection point, not just for the regional security in which American primacy in the Middle East no longer is believed in. It was unreliable and it turned out to be insufficient. during this war. But also, I think it potentially will become an inflection point for global American primacy. Because if country like Iran, with the use of drones, technology, missiles, and geography, can impose such a strategic defeat on the United States, and the United States is supposed to be able to fight two major wars in two different continents at the same time, I think we're looking at a scenario in which a lot of these different things have to be rethought. And one of the consequences may be is that the confidence globally in the American security umbrella may take a huge hit. And that would be a different scenario from what we've had in the last 10, 15 years, in which the American public is turning against the US playing that role, whereas the allies were constantly lobbying Washington to keep those bases and to keep those security umbrellas in place. That may now change. It may actually be assaulted from both directions.
Okay, let's get John's concluding thoughts by responding to my counter-argument to Trita that this could be a healthy development in the sense that, yes, it's been an humiliation for the United States, Iran, and I take on board Trita's points about Iran being more consequential than the Iraq War in 2003 for American credibility and future posture. But could this be the moment where American policymakers, once and for all, to use a neoconservative term, get mugged by reality and reorder strategic priorities away from Europe, which Trump wants to do, away from the Persian Gulf, which you both want to do, and focus more on Asia to contain the only peer competitor to American primacy, and that is China. John, cheer us up.
Well, I think it's possible, in theory, that could happen. The question you have to ask yourself is, when you look at the American foreign policy establishment, do you think there is cause for hope? And when I look at the American foreign policy establishment, I see a broken institution, and I don't see much cause for hope. I don't see any presidential candidates emerging in the Democratic Party at this point in time who are talking smartly about American grand strategy. I certainly don't see that in the Republican Party, although one could argue President Trump did talk that way, but then once he was in office, he didn't act on his rhetoric. But I think, Tom, the real problem here, more than anything else, is the influence of the Israel lobby. I think the Israel lobby is going to make it extremely difficult to get a meaningful settlement with Iran for a variety of reasons. I mean, we talked about the fact that the Israelis want to destroy Iran. But furthermore, if you look at Israel's war with Lebanon, and here we're talking about the war with Hezbollah, and you realize that Hezbollah is joined at the hip with Iran, and we're joined at the hip with Israel. And given that Israel and Hezbollah are going to continue to fight, that'll make it very difficult to get a meaningful long-term settlement for us in the Persian Gulf. And the Israelis and the lobby are just not going to let us leave. They'll put great pressure on us to be involved forever and ever. And they'll also put great pressure on us to remain in Europe because the lobby has long understood that Europe is a launching pad for the Middle East. So I don't see us, in large part, I think, because of the Israel lobby and its supporters in the United States, making the necessary adjustments here.
Trita, your final thoughts, your response to John's pessimism, and even my more relatively optimistic counter-argument.
No, I think the points that John made are very, very valid. We have seen, I mean, we should really not underestimate the tenacity and the determination of the pro-Israel lobby in Washington, D.C. The JCPA was a huge defeat for them, was a huge victory. It showed that when an American president really decides that something is in the U.S. interest, he will take them on and he will win. But then 2 years later, having undermined the agreement, worked really hard to make sure that they convinced Trump to pull out of it. They succeeded. According to Netanyahu, he took full credit for having convinced Trump to pull out of the deal, and the whole thing was set on fire and collapsed. So even if you manage to get that victory, it doesn't mean that the other side will accept that new reality and let it go. They will work very, very hard to reverse even decisions made by American presidents.
Well, Trita, great to see you again. Thanks for being back on the program. And John, it's always great to see you. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.